Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michelle Kelton. I'm the Vice President of Strategy and Development for NC Tech. We have a great program here for you today. We are on the home stretch leading into the 2024 elections, and we have an esteemed panel to discuss key trends and voter behavior and also take your questions. So if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and submit them through the Q&A. And we will be monitoring that throughout the call. I am going to pass it over to Joe Stewart, who is the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Independent Insurance Agents of North Carolina, who is a member of NC Tech. We're delighted to have your engagement. And many folks out there know Joe from his previous activities, including at the Free Enterprise group that did a lot of programs like this in the past. It was a highlight, I know, when I moved back from DC to join your programs and hear all of the predictions and stuff. So I am going to pass it over to Joe, who will take it over, and we'll meet our panelists, and looking forward to a lively discussion.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Long time personal and professional friends with Brooke Rayford. It's certainly in my heart and prayers at this point in time. And glad to be a part of this program today. We have what I would consider three of the rock stars among the political science community here in North Carolina, all run polling programs at the institutions where they teach. And so we're going to start out, let each of them introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their background and about the program at their school. David, why don't you get us started?
Great. I'm David McLennan at Meredith College. I'm founded the Meredith poll 10 years ago. And so, we're getting ready to go into our terrible teens in terms of our polling history. So I don't know what that means. But I started as a pollster really about 25 years ago, working in electoral politics. And so now I do academic polling, which is in some ways easier, in some ways more challenging. But it's been a pleasure to work with my two colleagues here in the North Carolina polling community. I've learned a lot from them in terms of academic polls, and we collaborate. A lot of people ask us why we don't compete more. Well, that's not what we do. We're all academic institutions, and we are collaborators. We share questions with one another, samples, data, that sort of thing. So it's been great working with these two gentlemen. I've known Joe for a long time as well. He's been very supportive of polling in North Carolina and putting on programs like this.
Martin?
Sure. Hey, thanks a lot, David. I want to reflect back, exactly what David said about, or I guess emphasize what David said about collaboration here in North Carolina among pollsters. I mean, part of it is like the numbers are the numbers. I think that around the table, you'll find a lot of consistent findings. And so I think that breeds more of a spirit of collaboration. We've got some of the same challenges, and then in the end, we probably find some of the same outcomes. I'm Martin Keifer. I'm the chair and a professor of political science at High Point University. I also direct our Survey Research Center, and we've been around really since spring of 2010. And we've been doing all kinds of things. We do, political and policy polling, but, we may be best known for polling everybody's favorite holiday pie each year. That probably gets more attention than almost anything else. So in any case, that's what I do. I did have a little bit of a background in consulting before came here, worked in the U.S. House for a little while as a staff member. So, my practical politics background comes from that. But, this is the longest I've ever held a job. So really, this is kind of what I do now. So thanks a lot for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason Husser. I'm a professor of political science at Elon University and also direct the Elon University poll. It's great always to be with this group of folks, Joe included. Every election cycle is great because there's an opportunity to connect with Joe. As mentioned before, David and Martin and I are in communication, not just around elections, but all 4 years of a cycle. What stands out to me about the Elon poll, the High Point poll, as well as Meredith poll, is that we are all part of very undergraduate focused teaching institutions. And we see what we're doing as a public service to the state, that we're providing information about what people want in North Carolina, not just in election season, but also when the General Assembly is operating. Times when big national media outlets aren't in North Carolina, we're still here. We're still asking the types of questions. And we're also doing this because we think that data is relevant for decision making, and we think that exposing our undergraduate students to data collection, data analysis helps them when they're as citizens as both as well when they're going to work at companies. And we hope that some of the companies here today will hire our graduates.
Jason, we'll come back to you to start off. The first question, we want to talk a little bit about North Carolina's political landscape. We are often referred to as a purple state. Some people say the purplest of all the purple states. Very close elections in the presidential contest, the last few election cycles have been determinative in terms of the national outcomes, in fact. But what does it mean from a public opinion research standpoint and looking at election results? What is it the way that you think of North Carolina in terms of this definition of being purple?
To me, it means is North Carolina electorally competitive at the presidential level. And the answer is very much yes. Now, there was a month or two there when Biden was lagging so much in polls that it looked like North Carolina could be moved into a likely Republican column. But I always anticipated, even if Biden had stayed on the ballot, that would tighten over time as the race kicked off. North Carolina is a state that can be deceptive to people in regards to its color. So some people think that North Carolina being a purple state means that we have a lot of moderates and that we have a lot of people who could swing one way or another in terms of their political leanings. That's not the case. North Carolina doesn't have that many moderates, but we have a lot of Republicans and a lot of Democrats who are largely balancing each other out, and then a small group in the middle that can tip the state one way or another.
And David, when you're doing public opinion research and you're looking at the results that you get, how much do you have to take into account that sort of sense of purpleness in North Carolina?
Well, it's really what we do, because one of the things that we talk a lot about, Jason Martin and I, is how we're going to get our sample, the people who respond to our surveys. And so in election year polling, we're trying to put together a model upon which to build our sample. And we have to look at just the status of North Carolina. So as Jason said, it's tight not just for presidential elections, it's tight for other elections as well. We might remember a Supreme Court race very recently that was decided by 401 votes. So, this idea of the purpleness of North Carolina extends up and down the ballot. Doesn't mean that, every race, because we know redistricting plays a huge role in legislative and congressional races, but every statewide race is going to be close.
And Martin, looking at some of the other characteristics of North Carolina's political landscape, a fast-growing state, an urbanizing state, not necessarily the history of North Carolina to be a place of big cities, and that's now an electoral reality, an incredible diversification occurring within the population and thus among the voters of the state. How do you see those types of dynamics manifesting themselves in terms of the public opinion research that you're doing?
Well, we have to take them into account. We want to make sure that the samples that we get are going to be balanced in terms of urban and rural divide, in terms of the cities, the counties that people are coming from. And we also want to make sure that, we're representing people in terms of their other background characteristics. Probably around the table, we go through and say, okay, well, what are we monitoring most closely to see if you have to weight a particular part of our sample? And we definitely have to look at education level. We have a relatively highly educated workforce, but also electorate here in North Carolina. And you've got to make sure that you get that balance right. We're also, looking at increasing diversity. We've had some stability in terms of the racial makeup in the state, in terms of the major divide here. But for the most part, we have to be looking carefully at the growing urban areas and people who are coming in. I mean, one of the things that you sort of have referenced, we've added 2 congressional seats in the U.S. House just in the last 2 census cycles. And so that creates a big difference. That's more power for North Carolina, but it also means that, we're a very attractive place to employ people and for people to retire. So we're looking at all those things as we as we try and make sure we're accurately depicting what people think.
And David, following up on that a little bit, where is it you're finding people are getting their information on politics? We know we used to have campaigns that did a lot of retail handshaking. Candidates engaged in crazy forums and debates where they would actually talk about the issues of where they stand. We see that decreasingly. The governor's race here in North Carolina this year, there will be no real debate. They did meet on the public stage a few times, the two candidates, Josh Stein, the Democrat, and Mark Robinson, the Republican, but none of the historical sort of bringing together the two candidates for a moderated discussion on the issues and their background and experience and what they felt qualifies them for the office. But what are you finding as you dig into public opinion, that where is it that people are going to that they consider to be the reliable source for their information on candidates and campaigns?
Well, it's become very fragmented, Joe, and kind of building off what Martin said, our population is changing. If we looked at young voters, they're getting their political information off social media almost exclusively. We go to older voters in North Carolina, they're still maybe getting it from broadcast or cable. As you said, we've had fewer political debates, well, at least at the gubernatorial level, but we've had some at the other races. But, by and large, people are going to their own partisan sources in many ways. And there is no sort of common source anymore as it was 2 or 3 generations ago in terms of not only debates but news sources. So that makes it really challenging for campaigns, I know, in the state of North Carolina. But as we think about polling, try to ask people if there's anything that that affected your voting decision, trying to tie it back to an information source is really difficult.
Well, and Jason, we see in the polling a lot of people expressing how incredibly locked in they are. They've made the decision they're going to support the candidate of one party, regardless of the other candidate. In fact, many times you see in polling now, people express their unwillingness to even consider voting for a candidate of a party different than theirs. How is that affecting your ability to gather information on where people stand? If they're so locked in, they're not even really looking at what's happening in an election. Does that mean that the polling is easier because people are so firm in their decisions earlier in the election cycle?
In some states, because things are so polarized, because partisan attachments are so strong, it makes a pollster's job easier. So if we were in Alabama or California, we can be really confident in our numbers in terms of the direction of what's going to happen, simply because people rarely vote against party now. However, North Carolina is not one of those states. I often liken being a pollster in North Carolina a lot to being a weather forecaster in North Carolina or a meteorologist. This is not the easiest region to talk about weather in, and it's definitely not the easiest region to talk about politics. So what we have in North Carolina is a situation in which vast majority of people made up their mind about how they were going to vote before the candidates were even nominated for office. Even if they weren't honest with themselves, we still could have predicted how they were going to vote. What that means is that there's a small number of people who are persuadable, and then there's a larger group of people who may or may not turn out to vote. And so what polls are really measuring at the end of the day is that small number of people who might change one way or another, and then those marginally mobilized people, the people whose turnout is not guaranteed, but that it's likely depending upon the situation. I think we're now in a spot in North Carolina where whatever issue is at the top of more people's minds on election day may be determinative, where we're seeing this 1 to 2 point advantage depending on the day for Trump versus for Harris. Those undecideds may end up breaking one way or another depending upon which issue they're thinking about when they're voting.
In Martin, looking at the polling, we've seen some significant change in the last several months, of course, with the announced decision Joe Biden would withdraw from the race and Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee. That altered the landscape pretty enormously in terms of people's perception of the matchup between she and Donald Trump. Very close in the polling now, the presidential contest, a little separation growing in the governor's race here. What do you make of the current state of the polls in North Carolina? And can you tell anything as we enter into this home stretch before Election Day, that the trend lines that you've seen since the first of the year of the polling give you any sense of how things are likely to actually play out here?
Yeah, I guess I don't want to punt too much on this, but one of the things that I would say is because margins of error, or however we construct, these potential errors in polls are broad enough that it's really hard to know, who is really up here in North Carolina. It could be that there's some systematic problem one way or another with the polling, or we're dead on. But we probably won't know that until, election day to be sure. And that can be state by state. It could be something about what's happening in North Carolina, or it could be some sort of systematic thing nationwide. So let's assume that we're doing pretty well. One of the things that we try to do, to get a handle on any volatility is ask some questions pretty consistently over time. And so one of the things that we do is we ask about relative importance of issues, and then we look at what we call issue ownership. So which party do you trust more, or do you think will do a better job on issues? And that stuff has been pretty consistent. There are sort of Republican-owned issues that come up over time, and that's included the economy recently for this cycle, but then also things like national security, sometimes law enforcement. Those are things they have an advantage on the minds of voters or the general public. Then, Democrats may have an advantage on things like education and Social Security and healthcare, so forth. And when we can see those regularities playing out against as the background, I should say, of whatever those findings are at the top of the ballot test, then we know our estimates are probably pretty good. And then we can look at them and say, yeah, yes, in this case, it's a really tight race.
And David, looking at the array of issue sets and how it's played out in terms of its motivation of various voter segments, are you surprised at all at what you see in public opinion research in terms of what is really of greatest interest in this election to voters in terms of matters of public policy?
Not really. I mean, we try to look at not only having people rank order issues, but kind of pair them up against one another. For example, everybody talks about the economy being the top issue. Well, generally that's true, but it's not true for every segment of the population. Abortion has been a big issue in 2024, and we find that certain groups of voters in North Carolina rank abortion to be more significant in their voting decision than the economy. So I think that's what we've all been sort of alluding to with this configuration of North Carolina is it's a very complex state, and so even though partisanship is a great driver of voting decisions, you break it down by demographic group and you find some really interesting differences in terms of there's some groups where immigration is of greater importance than the economy. And there's some groups where abortion or even the war in Gaza is a significant driver of their voting decisions.
And Jason, one of the things when Kamala Harris came online as the Democratic nominee, there was a lot of attention that her campaign focused on younger celebrities, a lot of internet based famous people, a lot of young producers. The one debate she had with Donald Trump, the more important news was the following day, Taylor Swift endorsed her campaign. That was more significant. But a resurgence of interest and enthusiasm for Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee among younger voters and particularly younger women voters. But what sort of things are you finding in public opinion research about that cohort of younger Americans, how they perceive politics, what they think of candidates, and are they expressing frustration that there doesn't seem to be the kind of age relevance of the choices that they have? All the candidates seem old, and the younger people want to see folks that are more like them in terms of generation. What is up with the young people, I guess, is the question.
It's a great question. So here's just a quick snapshot. In our last poll, we found Harris was at 48% to 40%, so an 8-point lead among those under 44 years old over Trump. And so there is sort of a baseline advantage that we're finding that Harris has among younger voters. Younger voters are increasingly a challenge for pollsters. We're not doing telephone polls anymore, but in 2016, I was basically calling more millennials than I should have had to. So I was looking at our past polling and trying to figure out how many more millennials do I need to call than say Gen X or silent generation or boomers in order to get the number of millennials that should be in a population just by randomly calling. And so I was ended up doing about 5 times more effort to get a single respondent who is in the millennial generation. Now most polling has moved online. I think all 3 of our polls are largely doing online polling methods. And so it's in some ways easier to reach the young voters, but they may be a bit different. Particularly I worry about we're not capturing young male voters as well as we could be doing, simply because they're kind of disengaged. We have noticed among young voters, in terms of other opinion things, potentially heightened levels of anxiety around the state of the world. The state of the economy affects them differently. If someone is buying a house today, say that they graduated from college, got their first job, worked for a year or 2, lived in an apartment, decided to buy a house at 25 for a young professional route, that's a very different experience than if they had decided they hit that life milestone in, say, 2014 instead of 2024, simply because interest rates have gone up, and importantly, housing rates have gone up. This isn't exactly an answer to your question, but it's a fascinating thing that I think it may be of interest to the audience. We all know North Carolina's grown. Drive along the 40-85 corridor, and it's indisputable. North Carolina is growing. The state as a whole has grown about 10% in total population, but the number of households in North Carolina have grown by about 15% over the last 10 years. And that's a product of 2 things, lower birth rates, and so smaller household sizes, and also people who are increasingly financially able to move out of their parents' nest. Housing stocks, on the other hand, have not gone up at the rate of household growth. And so in North Carolina, there's, to David's point about the economy means different things to different people. Depending on where you live, housing costs may be impacting your view of the state of the world. When you have such growth along that 40-85 corridor, and then you had declines in population in certain rural areas.
In Martin, some of these other demographic subgroups within the voter population, we've seen changes in terms of how we could reliably determine their voter disposition. You know, we used to be working class Americans were solidly Democratic and union members were solidly Democratic and the country club Republican was an image. But many of these sorts of demographic identifiers now are not necessarily correlated in the same way in terms of voter engagement and their actual performance. What are some of the ways you've seen shifts within the demographic subgroups among American voters and how they think differently about candidates and partisan identity?
Yeah, over time, we have seen some shifts like that, and it can be something that happens relatively quickly, or it can be, you know, over the long term, we see these changes. Because one of the places I thought that Jason or David might go with this too was that at the beginning of this election cycle, we saw that young people had a really pretty unfavorable view taken as a whole of Biden, or we could say the Democratic nominee for president. And I looked at the data because I didn't believe it. I was seeing these stories about it. And in fact, yes, we were seeing a net negative view that exceeded that of older Americans or older North Carolina residents and so forth. But then, you know, the switch at the top of the ticket inverted that. All of a sudden, there was a scramble because, you know, some people were identifying more with and supporting more Kamala Harris, and others were not, you know. And so now we've settled back to what I think is actually a more standard alignment in terms of how people are thinking about the candidates on a Democratic and Republican divide. Now, as far as some of the slower things, I do think that, you know, Jason's exactly right. We want to look at, you know, what young people are doing, particularly, you know, the role of a possible gender divide or gap, you know, between how younger women and younger men, you know, are thinking about politics. Because we always, or since I've been polling, we've always talked about a gender gap, but it may be get even bigger in the future. We've not seen in our polling, and I'd be willing to listen to exactly what Jason and David would say in this case. We've not been seeing as much of a shift in sort of racial identification with particular parties. we still see relatively high levels of support, for example, among African Americans for Democratic nominee, for president, whenever we did the polling. And so whether or not that's really going to realign, I think that's something to watch here in North Carolina, just like every place else. And also, too, as our Latino or Hispanic population grows over time here in North Carolina, it'll be easier for guys like us to get some more insight into whether there are any trends emerging there. Right now, that's a little bit more difficult because it's a smaller cohort, it's a smaller subsection of the population in the electorate itself.
And David, what are you seeing in terms of the change people's identity on a partisan basis when people say that they are a Democrat or they are a Republican or they are a member of a third party? Do those definitions have the same meaning that they once did, or do particularly younger generation Americans, is it a different way they perceive of what it means to identify with one party or the other?
Well, we can look at not only polling results, but we can look at even voter registration and seeing that, a lot of young people are not registering as party members. They're registering as unaffiliated. It doesn't mean that they're going to vote, as Jason said earlier, as true independents. They still have preferences. But in polling, we're seeing some of the same things. Young people clearly have their partisan preferences. I'm seeing a little bit of a shift in terms of in the younger generation, males are moving more conservative, particularly on some issues, and women are moving a little bit more to the left, and that's among millennials. So we're seeing some changes there, but then you see a lot of overlap between young men and young women on some policy issues like climate change. So it's, again, very complex to be looking at these changes. And I'm like Martin in that I'm a little hesitant about taking one snapshot in time and trying to make a broad generalization about this is how young people or this is how Black voters or Latino voters are going. We're looking for trend lines and things beyond just simply one poll administration.
And Jason, one of the other dynamics that's present in North Carolina, you alluded to this earlier. We are, by the designation, I think it was the 1990 census, they determined North Carolina was an urban state. More people live in a municipality than do not. But even today, we are second only to Texas in the per capita portion of our population that is rural. So we're a very rural, urban state. And we've seen the political nexus of North Carolina shift to urban versus rural was west versus east. And now it's this other dynamic. In the cities and the metropolitan areas are the parts of the state that continue to grow. Do you see significant changes in North Carolina's political landscape as a result of that dynamic?
There's several things going on with population change in North Carolina. One is natural changes. So changes about people who are born in a certain county. And of course, after 18 years, then they're eligible to vote in that county. There's international migration, which is relevant for the economic sector, usually less so for the political sector, simply because it takes a long time to get citizenship. And then there's migration within state, interstate or intrastate migration, and then interstate migration of people moving from other regions to North Carolina. If we were holding elections and only native North Carolinians could vote, we would see Republican victories across the board. North Carolina has turned purple in many ways because of migration from other places. We've seen a lot of migration from New York, a lot of migration from Florida, but it's easy to fall into the assumption that those New York voters moving here are universally liberal. I'll give you an example. My brother-in-law is from Long Island. He left Long Island because he did not like Long Island politics or taxes. And so now he lives in North Carolina because he felt that North Carolina was a better fit for his value system than where he lived. A lot of the growth in the Charlotte area, as well as the Research Triangle area, are from high earning people who wanted to be in a place where there was less tax burden. And so that's why we haven't seen a total flip of the state, because many of these migrants, they're not as liberal as their states that they're coming from might be. A couple other dynamics that are important to know in that is that we've seen growth in suburbs we don't really know what it's going to be yet. So if we just look at from 2020 to 2023, 25 counties in North Carolina that Biden won gained 175,000 people. The 75 counties that Trump won gained 206,000 people. But who are those people that they're gaining? So potentially some of the Charlotte suburbs maybe look a little bit less red because there may have been people moving out of Charlotte for affordability reasons to more of the red suburbs. You could potentially have a similar story. So I'm here in Alamance County, in the town of Elon, and we've had a number of people moving from Durham, Orange County, and Wake County into Alamance County simply because it's more affordable. And so many of those folks have probably moved Alamance County a little bit closer to being competitive for Democrats. We're going to learn a lot after 2024 about how these migration patterns are impacting the state. And I don't have definitive answers, and it's not that I'm hedging, it's because it's a level of granularity that surveys just can't represent.
You know, it's interesting. Harry Truman once said of economists that he had hoped to meet one day that only had one arm, because he was tired of every economist saying, but on the other hand. So, but as pollsters, you understand that you're taking a snapshot in time and you're evaluating what public opinion is at that moment in time, and it can shift and change. There are some dynamics and trends that you see, but it is just an analysis that's done based on what people are telling you they think and feel about things. Before we pivot and start to talk about the particular elections, curious for any of the three of you, any other trends that you're seeing, micro trends, even subtle differences in terms of public opinion and how it manifests itself against demographic or economic or other conditions, things that you see as emerging in North Carolina's political landscape? Any of the three of you?
Well, one of the things that we have been measuring since we started polling at Meredith is this idea of polarization and what type of polarization exists. You know, we've always had issue polarization. You know, people have different viewpoints about a policy issue, whether it be abortion or paying teachers. You know, what we're finding is that particularly over the last 8 years, we've seen an increase in terms of emotional or affective polarization, in terms of how people think about people on the other side. And so it's, you see this nationally, but we picked up on it in North Carolina. We really are seeing, you know, sort of like Jason mentioned early on, there's not a lot of people in the middle, and there are not a lot of people who are neutral about people with different views. And so again, one of the things that I'm concerned about is just, you know, how people feel about politics, and how, particularly in the 2024 election, you know, how they feel if their particular candidate does not win. We've seen an increase in terms of North Carolinians, at least maybe not wanting violence, political violence, but being kind of accepting the idea that there may be political violence related to this year's election. You know, it's not a majority. It's not even close to a majority of North Carolinians. But again, the uptick in the last 6 or 7 years has been pretty amazing and concerning, actually.
Jason, Martin, other trends you're seeing?
The trend that I'm following, and it's part because Elon started a center called Imagining the Digital Futures, thinking about the future of technology and society, particularly AI, is what are people concerned about regarding artificial intelligence? We're starting to do national surveys around AI and other tech issues at least once a year, probably twice a year, and also asking at the state level. So I'll just give folks a preview because it may be of interest to this audience, is that we found that people in North Carolina thought that AI could impact the election. We asked how likely, if at all, do you think it is that the use of AI in these ways will affect the outcome of the presidential election? We found 2/3 of people thought AI would target some voters to try to convince them not to vote. 77% thought it was very or somewhat likely AI would be used to generate fake information, videos or audio. And then 80% were concerned about social media manipulation happening through AI and bots. This is something we also picked up at the national level in more in-depth questions.
Martin, any other thoughts on trends?
Sure. And maybe this is more a trend to watch rather than one that I've got a whole lot of evidence for right now. But through our conversation, I've been kind of thinking about the future. And elections are relatively blunt instruments for delivering messages to our elected officials. And we talk about statewide, you know, how things are being voted. And then we look at like the General Assembly districts and, you know, judicial districts and things like that. You're not often giving clear signals on policies, especially in an election like this, where everybody gets out to vote. They're being told a lot about, what their considerations ought to be in voting. So one of the things that I'm committing myself to is doing a better job of charting how people are feeling about accountability in the legislature and statewide officials and so forth for the policies that are most important to them. Because we're talking here about, okay, what are the most important issues and so forth. After the election, it's going to be important potentially to track trends to see where people are happy and when they're not happy. And then, Jason, one of the things that you were saying, that's what got me thinking even more about this, that emerging technology and the rapid increases in the types of applications for AI and other kinds of emergent technologies may be something that people are going to demand additional accountability from government on. Our federal system makes that even trickier, but it may be that they won't. And so I think it's important to look ahead and figure out, well, in the future, let's be tracking those things to see how people are thinking about their elected officials and what kinds of things they ought to be accountable for.
All right. Well, pivoting to the election, everybody has awareness. Everything is being characterized as very close in the presidential contest right now. 7 states are considered to be battleground locations. The polling seems to be all within the margin of error in all 7 states, including North Carolina. David, why don't you start? What do you think the state of the presidential contest is nationally and here in North Carolina?
Well, just for a point of comparison, I think it could be closer than 2020. And so if we look at North Carolina in 2020, less than 75,000 votes separated Joe Biden from Donald Trump. I could easily see that margin shrink in 2024. And then, looking at the polling averages across the other battleground states, there's no race that's outside the margin of error. And so, I think it's pretty common to talk about it like this, but I think this is a mobilization election where could be the number of doors that get knocked on could affect North Carolina and the other battleground states.
Jason, your thoughts?
My thoughts is I'm trying to figure out how to preempt the election day hangover of people saying that pollsters were all wrong again, because we're in this situation in which consistently across the board, the dozens of different polling organizations working across these 7 swing states are showing all 7 of them are too close to call. That does not mean the election will be close in the end. And so I think that there's a very real possibility that the electoral college outcome is not close. One side wins decisively in terms of electoral college votes, but pollsters were still right, but we're just blamed for being wrong. And the reason for that is if you've got 7 swing states that are up for grabs, there's a lot of electoral votes still on the table. So I'm looking at 270 to wins sort of consensus map of toss-up states. So those 7 states have 93 electoral college votes. They're all within the margin of error for almost every poll being conducted. It is conceivable, I don't think it's likely, but it's conceivable that one side catches good headwinds or tailwinds and flips, say, 5 of those 7 states towards them. The undecided voters break 2/3, 1/3 rather than 50-50. In that situation, you'll see a decisive electoral college victory, even though the polls could have all been right, that it was within 3 points, one way or another.
In thinking about Martin, the switch out in the presidential contest when Joe Biden decided not to pursue the presidency and Kamala Harris came on, there was starting to grow a gap between Biden and Trump in North Carolina in terms of the polling. It's closed considerably here. Is that the story in all of the 7 battleground states? Is the momentum that Kamala Harris's campaign has been able to build over the last just few weeks, really, is that enough to win? Is that the question that remains for those 7 locations?
That sounds like the right question. And I think that I'll associate myself with Jason and David's remarks in this regard and say it's like one of the things is the level of granularity that you'd have to understand what's going on with these electorates is daunting for people who do what we do. And so in the end, it may be, as Jason suggests, it's a matter of, who's breaking in what direction. But this mobilization bit is really tough to wrap your arms around, especially when the campaign's at the presidential level, not to mention gubernatorial level here, but in the other states, like the Senate level and so forth. People are employing very different tactics in order to try and bring people out to vote. And the relative effectiveness of those and the receptivity of the people themselves to those tactics, that's not something that is easy for us to get a handle on. And it could be that difference one way or another. So again, I don't want to punt on this, but I do think that it's an important thing to understand about the polls. If we, see a particular candidate winning by 1% and the other one wins by 1%, for us, we got it right. But we know that when you're counting the touchdowns in terms of, who scored what on election day, then if you didn't get the direction quite right, then you lost. So we'll see about this, but I do think, what we're seeing here in terms of mobilization in North Carolina, the former president was here in 3 different areas, 3 different media markets yesterday, and he's in Greensboro, like miles from my house today. And then we can imagine that, the vice president's going to be in town. Like all of those things potentially make a difference, but they may counteract each other because there's so much attention. And I'll leave it at that because I can go on talking about uncertainty for a long time.
Well, looking at the other federal races in North Carolina, no Senate race. It's the way the 6-year term cycles work. Every now and then there's not a U.S. Senate race on the ballot. 14 congressional districts, brand new districts. There were new districts drawn in 2022 based on the 2020 census lawsuits, and those districts were thrown out. The legislature put forth new districts. We're current congressional delegation, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans. The way the new district lines are drawn, very likely to produce 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats, with only one district truly competitive at this point. The first congressional district, the northeastern corner of the state. Don Davis, the incumbent Democrat, Lori Buckhout is a retired military officer, run against him. David, in that first congressional district, what are the factors that are going to make a decision that affect the outcome there in terms of the other statewide races that are going on, or other things relevant to that congressional district?
Well, I think it's not unlike the conversation we've been having. I mean, I don't poll congressional races for a lot of reasons, but I could just think that we have all kinds of sort of winds blowing in different directions. We have what's going to be the effective from the top of the ticket. We have in a governor's race that has seemed to have changed over the past few weeks. Is that going to affect even the turnout for in District 1? So, again, I think this is going back to what Martin and Jason have been saying. From a polling perspective, it looks to be a tight race from the polls I've seen, but again, it could be a shift of just a couple thousand voters, depending on mobilization efforts, or just what's on top of the mind on election day, and the polling could be pointing in the wrong direction. So, I think it seems like it's getting a lot of attention, but how that's translating to voters, I'm not sure.
Well, in sort of going further down the ballot, we, of course, have these 10 statewide executive branch offices, governor, lieutenant governor, 8 others. For whatever reason, in the DNA of North Carolina's political history, we wanted to elect every damn buddy that worked in the executive branch. It makes it very complicated for voters. It's a lot of races and a lot of candidates to have to keep up with. We started this election cycle. The assessment was we would have the most competitive gubernatorial contest of all the states that were having governor's races this year. That's not proven to be the case, Jason. What's going on in the gubernatorial contest, and what impact do you see on that in these other down ballot statewide races?
Well, I think most folks looking at North Carolina's governor's race thought that this would be both the most competitive governor's race of the cycle and the most consequential. It's not the most competitive right now, but it could still be the most consequential. There's been a lot of immediate thought that Robinson's lag in the polls, and it's not Stein doing so well, it's Robinson lagging, was going to bring down both Trump in North Carolina as well as the Council of State General Assembly races. And there's some basis for that thought. In terms of the reverse coattail of Trump, I think that's less likely, but it's possible in the sense that Robinson's not as effective at mobilizing people as a popular Republican would be. And so that doesn't help Trump any, that he doesn't have a Republican governor boosting his turnout game. But I have not yet polled or released data on the Council of State races. We're currently in the field with the survey about Council of State races. Looking at some other surveys, though, so far it seems that voters had not connected Robinson with those Council of State races in a way that was dragging them down. And I think that had to do with low information about the races. The Council of State are obviously better known than some races, but when I talk to people, just colloquially about what do you think about your sample ballot, they often talk about some Council of State races the same way they talk about the soil and water district conservation district supervisor, and they're like, what does that do? And so because North Carolina has sort of technical offices like auditor that are elected, I think it can be confusing for people to use any kind of information other than the party heuristic. So while, in summary, they have a liability in that Robinson is so unpopular right now, but it may not impact them simply because people aren't paying that much attention to the down ballot races.
And Martin, can it be absolutely true? All of these surrogates that are coming into the state for the presidential candidates, former President Bill Clinton, former President Barack Obama, tremendous a number of points of engagement for voters in the presidential contest. This very unique dynamic in the gubernatorial contest where the Republican nominee, Mark Robinson, has had things come out, revelations about him that have caused people some real concern. Can it really be true that there's no down ballot impact from all of that clutter up ballot?
It can be a wash for sure, but also too, it can be very difficult to conceptualize. And for voters, they have to understand a lot about those races to make distinctions based on things other than party. One of the things, though, again, I'm going to go back to mobilization questions, and maybe somebody else on the panel can educate me in terms of any of the literature on this. That's one of the things about those U.S. House races that you might ask a similar kind of question about. In a situation where those are less competitive than in previous cycles where you could have very closely divided electorates and competitive House races, that can get additional people out. Again, the presidential race dominates everything when it's there on the ballot. But there are these niches, and I think that, Joe, that's what you're trying to get at, where people are paying attention to a particular thing, and that might make a little bit of difference in terms of how they decide and whether they get out. That is a very complicated question. So I'm not going to say that up and down the ballot doesn't matter, but I do think that starting at the presidential level and working down is probably the best way to do it, that it's not the case that further down the ballot, they're affecting things above them or even necessarily below them, because people go into the booth, they know they got to vote on the president, and then they decide, on those other things. And I'll leave it at that. I mean, we can talk a little bit more about specific races too.
Well, and David, one of the phenomena of this election being watched very closely is the partisan control of the North Carolina General Assembly. Currently, Republicans enjoy supermajority in both chambers, meaning they hold enough seats to be able to override a gubernatorial veto on a party line vote, 30 of the 50 in the state Senate and 72 of the 120 in the House. The way the district lines were drawn, all new maps there as well, in addition to the congressional maps. The partisan historical voting patterns would reveal that the Republicans have a pretty considerable competitive advantage in terms of the likelihood of winning enough of the districts to have a majority. The question seems to be whether they can maintain that supermajority margin. Do these up ballot phenomena impact some of these down ballot state legislative races and affect in the outcome relative to the Republicans holding a supermajority?
I echo what Martin said. I think you start at the top of the ticket and kind of go down even into the legislative races. But, there are some unique qualities in House District 105. This is the seat that Tricia Cotham holds. She switched from being a Democrat to being a Republican during the last session and caused the supermajority to exist in that chamber. Democrats have particularly targeted that race, and they've put a lot of money into it and a lot of attention into it. And so, I don't think that everything is determinative from the top of the ticket down. So, again, how Trump does or how Harris does will maybe cause the break in the supermajority or not. But I think, you have to look somewhat at the individual races. And that's one example of a race that's gotten a lot of attention and, maybe operating somewhat independently of other races.
Any other factors or phenomena? I mean, all of you have included in your surveys before what's called the generic ballot, where you ask the person, regardless of who the candidate might be, is it your intention to vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate for your state legislative race? And it looks like in the surveys that I've seen that in the generic ballot, it's remained pretty close. And historically, as long as it's remained close, that seemingly has favored Republicans in terms of their holding a majority in the General Assembly. But Jason, any other dynamics in the landscape in North Carolina's political culture that you see that might impact some of these legislative races beyond dynamics like what David described?
Well, as it started out, I treat any type of conversation around these General Assembly races with a great deal of humility, in that there's so many of them, it's really hard to know. But the second is that because of gerrymandering, most of them aren't competitive. And because of incumbency, many of them aren't that competitive. And so while a generic ballot does tell you something, it doesn't necessarily say much. So for instance, on the Senate, there's maybe 10 Senate seats that are competitive. On the House, there's maybe 20, 25 House seats that are competitive. Because there's so few that are competitive, a lot of money is going into those seats. And given the amount of advertising dollars, the amount of direct mail people are getting in those highly competitive districts, you could see real outliers between a competitive district and a generic ballot. And so I'm just approaching the General Assembly races as we don't really know. There's polling that's being done primarily by the campaigns within those districts themselves. They're not necessarily releasing that. Because telephone response rates have fallen so dramatically, I would question increasingly the quality of polling and accuracy that could take place at particularly a House level. We're talking about a little less than 100,000 people. I mean, you could call every single household in some of those House districts and not get a sufficient sample size nowadays. Where in the past there wouldn't have been an issue at all. We used to do Alamance County surveys. You can't do that anymore because you can't get enough respondents, even if we call everybody.
That's interesting. Is that a dream that pollsters have, that you would have the resources capable of contacting every single person?
It's like if you do a survey,
certainty that was a reflection of voter attitude.
You did a survey of Wyoming, you could maybe do that. It comes up in change of venue surveys for capital murder cases to try to figure out, is a jury pool in a small town, for instance, or a small county valid? And the short answer is a lot of times you can't figure it out from a survey simply because there's not enough people to talk to.
Martin, any other thoughts on state legislative races?
Yeah, I think that, again, I'd echo what my colleagues really said there, and then, maybe change the direction again. Like I mentioned before, it's like lack of competition in these U.S. House races. Maybe there's some sort of marginal effect there in terms of turnout, though so much of it comes from the top in terms of people's motivation to get to the polls. But something about these North Carolina General Assembly districts too, you do have a lot of people who are sitting as incumbents in pretty much the areas that they represented before. But you also have to think about, when we have these rapidly changing districts, it can be difficult for voters to keep track of who is going to be their representative and who was in the past. The example that I use with my students is, it's like I've been at High Point University for 15 years, and standing in whatever classroom I'm in, I'd been represented by 6 or 7 different people, and only a couple times that had to do with retirement, right? It's because what you did is you have these waves of redistricting. And so, it might favor Democrat, might favor Republican. Maybe it's a different person of the same party who has an advantage in that particular district because of the way things are cut up. So I do think that it puts additional demands on voters to know who, is going to be representing them, and make some connection between the political information that they've got and the people they're going to see on the ballot. It's a demand, and we have faith in voters, but the point is that matters when it comes to people's ability to make decisions.
Two final questions about the election, then we'll conclude. One, of course, there are 4 state Court of Appeals races, 1 state Supreme Court, 3 in the literal Court of Appeals. The appellate court system is elected in North Carolina. Not much attention given to these races. The candidates don't have a lot of resources. Historically, in the last several years, it looks like the designation of being a Republican has favored judicial candidates in these races. Any thoughts on any of those? I know these are ultimately really, really low information races that are going on, but anything in the court races that you guys think is relevant?
I think Robinson's relevant to those races potentially. So before I hedge, because I don't really know what sort of down ballot impact Robinson's going to have, but so I'll use my home county, Alamance County, where there's several district court races going on right now. If Robinson drags Republicans down 2%, that might be enough to make a difference in the district court races here in the county. In the district court, the local bar association is very impactful. Simply because lawyers have a lot of friends, they have big social networks, and oftentimes their local bar folks are the best position to be able to evaluate district court judges. That doesn't necessarily scale up at the appellate level or Supreme Court level. Another challenge is media markets for some of these judicial elections. If you're in Eastern North Carolina, Northeastern North Carolina, there may not be a clear media market of how you reach people. The internet's made that a little bit easier.
In one final question, also on the ballot this year, a constitutional amendment restricting voting to citizens only. This was one of several amendments that the Republican-led General Assembly attempted to get on the ballot, but this was the only one. Any of you see any impact in terms of voter attitudes or outcomes or even turnout models as a result of this particular topic being on the referendum on the state constitution on the ballot this year?
So in some states, in local elections, there's an opportunity for non-citizens to vote. It was never going to be probably on the table in North Carolina. I viewed that amendment just personally as kind of pessimistically, as this is a way maybe to drive turnout among people who were sensitive about immigration, because they had an anti-immigration stance. I'm not getting the sense that it's making that much of a difference given all the other things that are happening. It's not like Amendment 1 in North Carolina. Nor is it like an amendment in an off-cycle election in which turnout could be so variable depending upon what's on the ballot.
Right. Lightning round, final conclusions, go in order. David, any insights or observations? Early voting has started. About 1.3 million people have voted. Looks like about equal thirds, Democrat, Republican, and unaffiliated, have turned out so far. Anything you read into that, and any thoughts leading into Election Day?
Well, the only thing I would say is that Republicans have increased their early voting numbers, because despite what the former president says about early voting, there's been a concerted effort in North Carolina to get Republicans to the early voting polls to bank their votes. So I think that's clearly being reflected.
Jason, final thoughts?
Be prepared to be surprised. The polls, I think, are pretty good at getting us within 5 points. The key elections are all within 5 points. And so the only sort of systematic polling error that I think one should be surprised about is if somehow one of the candidates, Trump or Harris, just blows things out of the water and wins by 10 points. But I'm expecting to not know who's going to be the winner in North Carolina or in the nation as a whole until maybe a week after the election.
Interesting. All right, Martin, you get the last word.
Yeah, I think that I would agree with a lot of what my colleagues said, and just watch closely on election night to see the way things come in. There has been a big change in the people who are showing up for the earliest of the early voting. I mean, I used to track within my campaigns and elections class. You could watch party ID of the people who have voted change over time. From when the absentee ballots started coming in, there was a bigger Democratic advantage, and then you entered early voting and you saw that narrow right up into Election Day. The increase in the number of unaffiliated voters may change that a bit. but also too, the mobilization tactics matter. And that, as we've said before, affects all of us in terms of what we're finding, because it can be tricky to figure out exactly who's really motivated to get to the polls and in which way they'll vote on these tough races. And so as a final thought, I mean, I think that, again, yeah, we just watch real carefully up and down the ballot, because, you know, how well these campaigns, these parties are communicating to voters that their races are important when we've got such a big race at the top of the ballot that may be determinative in some of these cases.
Great conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much. You're such an incredible resource to the state of North Carolina, the work that you do in educating young minds and putting forth the next generation of our state's leaders. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for joining us today. Michelle? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
On behalf of NC Tech, thank you so much to our panel, David, Jason, Martin, and Joe, for this dynamic conversation. An hour went by very quickly. And thank you to all of the members who patched in to listen. We will be sending out a recording of the conversation, and we'll be posting it online for those who weren't able to join us this morning. So get out and vote. We're 2 weeks away. We may be 3 weeks away from knowing how things end up. But thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.